Good evening and welcome to the February 12, 2018 work session, a special discussion, joint discussion with Mayor and Council and the Board of Supervisors of Elections. Tonight we have one item for discussion. It is a debrief of the 2017 election. And leading us in this discussion is our legal services team, Lynn Board and Lauren Klingler, who administer our city elections. And for that, we're grateful. And I will turn it over to you guys.
Thank you, Mayor Ashman, and members of the council, members of the Board of Supervisors of Elections. The BOSC started following the 2013 election for each election cycle after it was over to do some debrief meetings to talk about what went well and what are areas of improvement, because we always feel that we can do a little bit better job. We're always striving to achieve better. And we like to do it fairly shortly after the election while the issues are, one, still fresh in our minds, but also if it's going to require any charter or code changes, we like to do those in off-election years versus in the middle of the election cycle. So tonight we're going to talk about a little bit about the 2017 election and what went well and what didn't go well, and then also look forward to the 2019 election.
And Lynn, before you start the PowerPoint, do you prefer to go through the whole thing and then do questions, or shall we take one piece and have discussions?
Whichever way. You know,
okay.
Certainly if there are questions that come to mind, please feel free to
they'll come to mind.
To jump in. So we can go from there, because I know sometimes if you wait till the end, it's a little bit sometimes difficult to remember particular topics.
Okay.
So generally we plan on covering 4 topics, but we want to make sure that this is not the all-inclusive, so if there are issues that you all noted during the election cycle, you know, there's certainly the opportunity to hear about other ideas or other changes that we need to make. But we did want to specifically address the topics of expansion of the election cycle, slates, campaign guidelines versus regulations, and recount provisions. So just by a way of background, for the 2017 election, the city had 35,330 registered voters. It's interesting, as of today, that number has gone down slightly. As of today, we have 35,121 registered voters. So I think we have a few people moving out of the city, and maybe a few new residents we need to get their attention and get them to register to vote.
Can I ask you real quickly, how do we know that number's gone down? Is there people have asked to be removed from the
we do get all of our voter database from Montgomery County, so we did ask Montgomery County today, and they did provide us with the updated number as of today. So that would be, again, people who have moved and have been removed from the voter registers for whatever
So the only
reason.
way they know if somebody's left the area is and is going to vote in the area is they have to ask themselves to have their name removed from the list
Yeah, I
of
mean,
voters?
that would be one, certainly, you know, death and other, you know, other items would also have you be removed from the voter register. The county does try to update their register on a fairly frequent basis, so they do look at that issue, those issues.
So the registered voter number on our screen, is that, when is that from?
That is from the day of the election. So on November 7th, 2017, that was the number of registered voters in the city of Gaithersburg. So the votes cast, we had 2 early voting sessions for the 2017 election. We had 335 votes cast during early voting, 98 absentee ballots, 16 provisional ballots were accepted. We had 45 cast, but 16 were accepted. And then on election day, 2,927 of our residents came out and voted. That equated to a 9.61% voter turnout, which we will all admit is not a great number, and we'd all like to see higher. Yeah. We have a couple maps. Our GIS staff came to us after the 2017 election and said, how would you like your voter information updated into the GIS maps? And we thought that was a great idea. So we have a couple maps here tonight are really just kind of examples of what we can do with this database. They have updated the 17 voter election information, and they're working on updating the 2015 so we can have more information. But some of the interesting things, if you look at the top 2 maps, it shows our voter turnout in 17 based on percentages of voter turnout and then also raw numbers. So you'll see, for example, Asbury is a good example. Voting in the election, we had 287 people who voted in Asbury, but they have a really high turnout number. So 25.4% of the Asbury residents who were registered to vote did vote. So again, just kind of interesting numbers and graphics to take a look at. The bottom two maps show early voting and absentee voting. Again, kind of interesting. You'll see a lot of the early voting is on the east side of the town, and that may be because it takes place at City Hall and it might be more convenient. Where the absentee voting is a little bit more spread out through the city. The next two maps we thought were interesting because this shows all of the active voters and who voted in the 2017. And we did these by kind of weighted colors. But we do have the ability to overlay neighborhood maps. Obviously the white areas are mostly our commercial areas where you don't have registered voters. But again, provide some interesting data, and we believe that this data can help us in future elections both to look where we need to target our voter registration efforts as well as our voter turnout efforts. Again, one example you'll see up in the GAO4, which is as part of the Villa Ridge voting district. You'll see a fairly high number of active voters, so people who are eligible to vote here, but then when you go over who actually voted, again, there's a very small number who actually voted. So this might be one area where we would want to focus some more efforts for voter registration as well as turnout.
So does active voters mean voters that are registered? That
are registered and eligible to vote.
It doesn't mean
example,
it doesn't mean ones that have voted regularly under some sort of pattern that we're looking at.
You are an active voter if you, and Laura, if you correct me if I'm wrong, if you have, as long as you have voted in the last, or you haven't missed more than, is it 2 elections? Yeah.
2 local elections or 2 elections in?
At 2 of any elections.
Okay.
Yeah. That you're eligible to vote in.
Mm-hmm.
The active voters also would not include, for example, when you're 17 and a half, you can register to vote, but you can't actually vote. So the county obviously captures that data that they're registered to vote, but you would not be considered an active voter until you turned 18. So there's a number of reasons why somebody might be a registered voter but not be an active voter.
Okay.
But again, we think that these are good maps and good tools that we can use going forward to kind of I think it'll also be helpful for candidates, possibly, to look at where you want to focus your efforts, but also a good tool for staff in the BOSC to look at where we can apply our data. And as we get more data, for more years, we're working on uploading our 15 data. We'll continue the data in 19 and future elections. I think that these can be very, very useful maps. And I want to thank Jan and Justin in our GIS department for all the work that
great job.
they've done with this. I mean, they could have provided you about 20 different versions of different maps, and we tried to focus them on.
So I have a
Would we have the data to show who's voted in, for example, presidential or gubernatorial versus local?
That's something we could probably get that data from the county. We normally don't because it's not our elections. We focus on our election data.
Mm-hmm.
But again, that would be probably information we could get from the county and then input that into the GIS system.
I mean, it would just be interesting for me to see that if you take the effort to vote in the gubernatorial and the presidential, you actually know how to vote.
Right.
You're just not interested in voting in a local election if you don't. So.
Sure.
So another question, I don't know if you have an answer for this at this time, but I know that in looking at the housing data, Gaithersburg has a much higher share of apartments than surrounding areas in the county as a whole. And I'm wondering if that correlates to why we have a lower voter turnout. Is there any, and plus, for candidates who are out knocking on doors, it's really hard to do that in apartment complexes, and it's easy to do that in owner-occupied housing. So I'm just wondering if that is a factor here, or if there's any way to know.
Yeah, there's, again, these maps are just a couple examples. We looked at all kinds of interesting, you can overlay like demographic information on these maps, income information, employment information. So I think that there are ways to get to that question. And we could also do it by housing types as well, single family versus multifamily. So I think that there is the ability to get to that information. Again, we haven't explored all the different filters, but there are a lot of them that we can put on these maps to, get some interesting data that can assist us in moving forward.
Okay, thanks.
Are you saying you'd be interested in, for example, targeting certain demographics then in who are represented or have a low representation in turnout?
Well, I mean, I think particularly with voter registration efforts, if we are finding that there are certain demographics that do not register at the frequency as other demographics, again, we might want to tailor our outreach efforts of, how do we reach this class of people? Or also, as far as turnout, if you see that by a certain demographic, certain groups of people are not voting, again, are there different ways we can communicate with that community in order to increase turnout, voter turnout in that community? So again, there's, whatever strategies we use for registration to increase registration and turnout, we might want to tailor to different demographics within the city.
I mean, I'd certainly be interested in targeting efforts to enfranchise more people rather than reinforcing those who already vote, for example.
Right.
So, yeah, I think it'd actually be interesting to look at the active voters in the multifamily rental areas, the city. But, I think actually they're dense in several areas, not just one or two districts. So, but
I mean, there may be a way, certainly when we look at our communications plan, we push out a lot of information to our homeowners associations, which they hopefully push out to their residents, but that doesn't always encompass all of the multifamily communities within Gaithersburg. So there may be, a need to look at some different communication method for those groups of people. So in the 2017 election, we made a couple changes. So we wanted to talk about those a little bit. First, we used Crown Farm as a new polling site for the first time. I think the election judges who were there loved the facility. They thought it was great. For candidates, I don't think you liked any of the facilities on elections day because it was a miserable, cold, wet, rainy day. But so generally, the feedback we got from people who came to that polling place was fairly positive. We had a few people who complained because it was a new site, and we've always gone to Isaac Walton League. Why are we not at Isaac Walton League? But I think over time that will change. Kind of the interesting thing is, even though we had much lower voter turnout in 17 than 15, we actually had more people vote by one person at Crown Farm than we had at Isaac Walton in 2015, even though we had generally every other polling place except one had lower voter turnout. So the change to Crown didn't seem to be an impediment for actually getting people out to the polling places. We also, as you know, implemented a new campaign finance system. This year it was still the online system. This was an in-house system built by our IT department. And again, I'd like to thank Andrew Barnes and Brian Helms, who did a lot of work on that system. We thought that worked fairly well. We did have a few little issues, primarily with getting information up after it was filed on a timely basis, and we've kind of looked at some strategies to be able to do that more quickly. But again, we thought that was fairly successful. But if any of those of you who use the system this year or follow the system this year, if you have particular areas of concern, let us know so we can get with our IT department and make corrections.
I'll just make one. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
Well, one of the concerns was with the double submission. You had the candidates submit the statement, you had the treasurer submit, so it was just totally different from any other race, and I don't know if that's something new that other jurisdictions are doing with the double checking, but it caused confusion because that responsibility is usually just the treasurer's responsibility. So,
but my treasurer didn't have to.
yeah.
My treasurer just sent me the report, and I filed the report.
Right.
exactly.
Same.
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue was that treasurers could not submit the report, where in
Oh, I
past
see.
In the
in
past,
past
the
campaign
treasurer was
cycles,
able
the
to
treasurer
do
could
that.
submit. Yeah,
Yeah.
it didn't have to be submitted twice. It's just that the treasurer could not submit the report. It had to be the candidate.
Yeah.
So that
Well,
was
my
one
treasurer had
change.
asked for credentials and wasn't given it because
Right.
I had the credentials. So,
Right.
that means if your treasurer's submitting your material, that means that you've given your credentials over to somebody else.
But you're not supposed to.
You're not supposed
Well,
to.
you're not supposed to do that, and that's my point, is
We
that there's
have-
only supposed to be one person submitting those
How do
reports.
other
And
jurisdictions
it's
handle that?
usually the treasurer only.
I think
Nope.
we are the only municipality that has the online campaign finance system. I know Rockville has contacted us and wants to get our system.
We sell it to them?
So do they allow the treasurer to snail mail it in then, or does it have to be the candidate himself to submit?
That I'm not sure, but we can
Okay.
check on that. But
Can I-
you know, certainly I know the state and the county do have online, but other municipalities do not.
I just want to clarify, despite sort of an assumption to this effect, because I know that the state and county have this requirement, there is no requirement in city law or regulation to have a treasurer for your campaign account under
That's
city
correct.
law. I do not have a treasurer.
Yeah,
I do
that's
my
correct.
own bookkeeping,
Mhm.
and I file my reports. So there is no treasurer requirement.
Correct.
I mean, I know people have them and use them, but I just want to point that out.
Right.
So if there's ever a problem with the Spiegel report.
Yeah, right, it's my fault, that's right.
Let's stop.
That's
But,
right.
go ahead, Neil.
So I've noticed that the online reporting for the last election cycle hasn't been updated since sometime in October. Shouldn't there be more recent reports online?
Yeah, there were reports, the most recent were the annual reports. And I can, actually, I don't know off the top of my head why those haven't been uploaded.
Isn't there supposed to
but
be a
there should
post-election
Yeah, there's a
report?
Yes.
final report.
Yeah, I mean, there was
I don't
one,
believe
there was
that
a
that's online. As of-
post-election and the annual.
I haven't seen any, I looked a couple of weeks ago just out
Okay.
of curiosity, and I didn't see anything.
Okay, we'll double check.
Lauren?
Andrew uploaded it last week,
Okay,
so it should be current and all reports should be.
all right.
No. But that was one of the issues we did see in this election cycle, that there was some delay in actually getting the reports themselves.
From the candidates or from?
No, uploaded after they
Okay.
were reviewed and approved by the Board of Supervisors for elections. So we've already talked to IT about a way of kind of speeding up that process, because, you know, part of when you're in the election cycle, that's when, you know, the residents and citizens want to see that information, so we want
Right.
that to be up there timely.
So is that something that'll be resolved by the next cycle?
We hope so, yes.
Lynn, my issue with the reports wasn't necessarily about the timing of them being posted, but once they're posted, if someone from the public or somebody from a media organization wants to evaluate, wants to take a look at everybody's reports, it seemed like there could have been some better ways. There can stand for some improvement with what the
search
data looks
functions.
like that you can
Okay.
download.
Okay.
And I think at one point I did it, and I ended up with a big Excel spreadsheet that I had to sort of sort to get the information I was looking to get. And it just seems like there's got to be a better way, even if it's just allowing the user to go in and download a full PDF for each candidate. That would still be better.
That's how it used to be.
You can do that.
You can.
You just filter it by which candidate, and it just gives you a spreadsheet for that candidate. Or
Spreadsheet or a PDF?
spreadsheet.
Yeah. Let's
Yeah, we
Take a
can
look at that.
we can take a look at that.
yeah.
One other system that we went to this year was we allowed online absentee ballot applications. And that was, again, really convenient to our residents who wanted to vote by absentee ballot instead of having to have request an application, have that mailed to them, then they mail it back. We did go to an online system for that to make that easier. Now, they still obviously had to have the ballots mailed out to them, but we wanted to cut a little bit of time out of that process. We also implemented as kind of a test this year a system called Ballot Tracks, which is a system that does what it sounds like. It tracks ballots for the absentee ballots. So it is also an online system that allows, if you have submitted an absentee ballot, it allows you to go online and see the status of your ballot, if your application's been received, whether it's been approved, whether your ballot's been mailed, whether your ballot has been, again, received back from the city. We did that in kind of a test mode this year, so we did the old paper logs that we used to do, and we did ballot tracks this year because we wanted to make sure that there were no glitches with the system. We did have a couple minor issues that the system kind of automatically generates messages out to people, and we found that some of those messages weren't the most accurate in the world. So we have talked to they were accurate as far as your status, but not the reason that you were getting the message. So we have talked to the vendor about being able to customize some of those messages for future elections.
So do people who have received an absentee ballot get a reminder that they have, that election day is this day and you have this many days to submit your ballot?
Yeah, they do not. I mean,
They
that's
do not?
part of the application process as to when it has to be received. But again, that may be something where, when we're looking at being able to customize some of the messaging
Yeah, because if
that
it's
we might be
already
able to
generating
do.
emails, it would seem like that would be a logical thing to do. So can you, maybe I'm jumping ahead, can you tell us how many absentee ballots were issued and how many were returned?
Yes, we do have a chart for that. I don't remember off the top of my head, but I believe.
Are you going to get to that? If
Yeah,
you're
we're
gonna
going to get to that. We're going to
then
get to
that's
that.
fine.
We're going to get
That's fine.
to that a little bit later, so. Okay, so one of the issues that came up during the elections, and actually this came up from the mayor and council, was really looking at extending our election cycle. Currently, we have 45 days from the date that the petitions are due till election day. And the proposal that came from the Board of Supervisors of Elections in looking at this issue was to expand that to a 75-day cycle, which would require an amendment to our charter. By comparison, we looked at other jurisdictions. Rockville has a 61-day election cycle, Tacoma Park 50 days. We also looked at Frederick and Annapolis, but because they are partisan elections that have primaries, obviously they have longer cycles, but it didn't really make sense to compare against those jurisdictions.
Well, you could compare to the date before the election, or the period before the election, even for a primary. I mean, that's an election cycle for the primary.
Right.
Once the primary's over, it's already been decided. There's no new candidates after that.
Correct.
Correct? So I think it would be interesting to compare.
To kind of backtrack
to backtrack to those primaries of what's the election period for.
Right.
So what's the logic behind extending the
Yeah.
period?
That was the
I think that there are a couple. When we have a pretty quick cycle, and a lot of times it really kind of pushes staff to get stuff done and stuff out very quickly. Part of the issue is, for example, like with the voter guides, you know, I know that we tell you all as candidates, you know, you've got to get your information to us when you file, and there is a really quick turnaround time. The staff tries to do as much of the voter guide prior to the petition filing date, but we really have about 2 days to turn around that material, get it to the printer, so it can be mailed out timely to get to our voters. So, I mean, I think that there's a lot that happens in a very short period of time for staff. So that's one of the issues. The other issue is we've really noticed with the requests for debates. If people don't know who the candidates are going to be, obviously they can't start inviting people to debates until they know who the candidates are going to be and certified. And that really only leaves about like maybe a 30-day window to try to get those organized and scheduled, which is not, again, very long period of time to do that, particularly when you know, the organizations, the candidates, and frankly this room where we would hold debates are scheduled, you know, many nights of the week. So it's, you know, kind of difficult. We found it difficult to even find dates that might be available. So if we extended that time a little bit longer, you know, we would have the more opportunity for, you know, kind of the citizen engagement as part of the election cycle.
Can I add to that?
Sure.
Since I was at least one, I don't know if others from the days were asking for this, but I also noticed in this election cycle that the voter guide was coming out, and it has information for people who want to vote absentee. But by the time the voter guide got out, we were very close to the absentee ballot application deadline.
Right.
I just thought, if you were a voter who was going to pay attention to it, but maybe you put it aside until the weekend to read the voter guide, you might miss that application for absentee ballot. I just felt like it was really cutting it too close.
Yeah, and really the absentee ballots was another issue because currently the ballots are available 30 days before the election cycle, and if we expanded the cycle, the proposal would be to have the absentee ballots available for 60 days, particularly if we have military who are overseas, if you have kids who are off in college, you know, who are across the country or a different state, you know, again, the 30 days is a pretty quick turnaround time to get all of that, you know, done and out. So, you know, that was, again, the other proposal would be to extend the absentee ballot period to 60 days, which again would require a code change to do that.
And then how often is the information updated when you get the requests in? Now that there's an automated system, is there a lag time between updating the system
On
when
the
information comes in?
ballot tracks?
Yeah.
I mean, that does go out immediately. I mean, in the 17 election, we found, I believe we had 119 absentee ballots that were filed. 96 of those were processed the same day that they were received. There was never one that, you know, was processed even, this is including weekends, and Lauren was here often on Saturdays going to the post office, picking up the applications as well as dropping off information. You know, so we tried to turn those around very, very quickly. So I think the longest one, except for one city employee who was going out of town and asked if she could manually pick hers up. Hers took 4 days because she wasn't here. The longest it took, including weekends, was 3 days to process any of the applications. So I mean, that's something that really staff takes, you know, wants to make sure that we get those out as timely as we can, because we know that, you know, again, with this really short cycle, we've got to get them back to people, because often, you know, we can't control the mail either. We did find in this election that for some reason, some of our ballots were delivered to the Montgomery County Board of Elections, who then mailed them to us.
Right.
So they were actually mailed twice.
So they mailed them
Yes.
to us
Yeah.
instead of
Yeah, and again,
giving a courier.
if they had called us and said, hey,
Right.
we've got some of your ballots,
Yeah.
we would have gone pick them up. But again,
We
that, you know,
noticed
that.
double postmarks, and we had to
Yeah.
try to figure out what was going on.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, I'm not sure why they were delivered to the county. They had our address on
I
them.
mean,
But,
Oh, the county board
the
is
Board
in
of Elections is
Gaithersburg.
in Gaithersburg. I mean,
Yes,
I don't
yes.
understand why
Yeah.
they wouldn't just call.
Yeah.
So the automated records are always up to date and always readily available.
yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
So the ballot tracks data, is that, what data is available to the public and as opposed to what the individual requester gets?
It is not an online system in the fact that anybody could go in and look at it. If people want that information, they would have to do a public information request, and then, you know, staff would turn around and provide responses with that information.
Okay.
Okay.
So the next slide really just kind of shows you an example of all of the deadlines. The current due dates, these are for the 2019 election. If we left everything as it is, this would be sort of when everything was due. If we expanded the additional 30 days so that there'd be a 75 days from the petition to the election date, and expanded the absentee ballot dates, these would show the new dates. We have also, because it also impacts the campaign finance reports, we've kind of spread those out a little bit as well, so that they're not quite, as you all know, when you get closer to the election, it probably seems like almost every week you have one of those reports due. So this would, I mean, there's still more focused towards the election date, but, you know, that would also spread out the due dates. And again, this would require changes to a number of our election ordinances. For the campaign finance dates, we'd have to amend sections 6C, 5, 7, and 9. And I do want to just mention in the packets, you'll see a whole lot of just sort of draft ordinances. Those are really there just for discussion purposes. If you all adopted, you know, everything we talk about tonight, those are at least draft ordinances just to start the discussion with these changes in them.
So is there a reason that 75 days came up instead of 60 or 50,
Well, I
given
think-
what we know from the other municipalities?
I mean, I think really what we did is the current cycle is 45 days. The board just looked to add 30 days to that. So I don't know that there's any magic to it. In fact, they talked different numbers, and you know, I think the recommendation was to expand that by 30 days.
Yeah, I was just wondering if it's based on any data from anywhere else other than, you know, adding 30 days to the current period, so.
Was there any dart thrown at, like
Yeah.
a ball?
Do you guys want to propose a different number?
No, so, you know, we've heard that, what is it, Rockville has 61.
61, and Tacoma Park has 50.
Tacoma Park has
Yeah.
50,
Yeah.
and they have many more candidates than we've had in the past, so. So, you know, it would seem that would be a reasonable period of time. For
Is that what
period.
you're saying, you prefer that?
You know, I'm just trying to figure what's our rationale for the numbers that we choose, and
Well,
I
75
asked,
is a good
and
number too.
So, but I'm asking, so.
3/4 the way to 100.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, it does extend the time, yeah, so, you know,
What
I
about-
don't think it's, I don't know that having it another 15 days longer is going to generate any more interest or candidates. But I think clearly part of the issue here is staff time, as well as preparing, having time to do that. So,
Topic near
I
and dear
mean,
to my heart.
I'm not.
It's a topic near and dear to my
Well,
heart.
it gives you more time to get the voter guide out, it gives you
Right.
more time to get the absentee ballots. I
No,
mean,
but you have
more
60
lead time,
days
right?
from the
Yeah.
day, from filing. From the filing deadline, you still have 60 days.
No, but I think you want to get them out
So-
sooner than later, is what I'm trying
Yeah.
to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, I understand that.
How
But-
early
So,
is the voter guide proposed to come out? Because right now, I think it came out 2 weeks before, 3 weeks.
Yeah, again, some of that depends, and Britta's probably our expert on that. You know, certainly we try to turn it around and get it to the printer within several days of actually having the certified candidates. And, you know, then there is some production time, and those do get mailed bulk. So they are a, you know, slower mail method than certainly first class.
Okay.
okay.
All right. The next topic we're going to turn to is slates, and as you all probably do know, that the issue of slates came up in the 17 election. So currently, the city code does not define the term slates, and we could find no municipality in the state of Maryland that their codes define the term slates. It is certainly in state law, and kind of interestingly, our code in several sections mentions slates. It didn't talk about creating one. It was more in the campaign finance areas. And so certainly in the definition in our current ordinance of political committee in section 6C1 references slates. And then in some of the reporting requirements for political committees and individuals in section 6C, 6, 7, 8, and 9, it references slates. So this created a little, and I have to admit, it's been that way for, I think, 2007. So that language has been in our code for, you know, at least 10 years. So this did lead to a little bit of confusion of, you know, you reference slates, but you don't talk about, the code doesn't talk about what they are or, you know, how they work, what you're supposed to do with them. So we did look at this, the board looked at this, and the proposal is to amend section 6C1, which is the definition section of the ordinance, to clarify the definition of political committee, and that's to make sure that to make it clear that a political committee is independent of the candidates. So a political committee would not involve any influence or direction from the candidates. And then to add a definition of slate, which would be two or more candidates joining forces to raise money, expend money, or holding joint events. And the definition of slate that we've used comes straight out of the state law definition of slate. So if we did that, we would add a new section 6C71, because now that you've added a definition of slate, it's what are you going to do with it? And this section would allow candidates to join a slate. And if you join a slate, it would require notification to the Board of Supervisors of Elections. And we've looked at some other jurisdictions, Rockville, Annapolis, and Bowie do have sections very similar to our proposed section 6C7-1. And a lot of them in the state and the counties do have forms when you create a slate, you know, for reporting that to your local board. And then certainly if we have a slate, then we would have to be able to account for contributions and expenditures from the slate. So we've added new campaign finance reporting requirements for slates that would mirror those of political committees. So that would be a new section 6C6.1. I do want to note that there was a minority opinion of the Board of Supervisor Elections. They weren't unanimous on this particular item, that really recommended that we do not add anything with slates to our code, but to delete the reference of slates in our existing provisions. The thought process behind that opinion was creation of the slate almost creates a double reporting requirement for the same expenditures. That our past practice has been when candidates have held have done joint campaigning events or joint expenditures of funds, they do already report that on their individual campaign reports. So really, I mean, I think that was when the board was a little bit split on as to what direction they wanted to go forward. So, certainly,
Yeah.
I'll
that
let
was
you
gonna-
all start the
Well,
discussion on that
that was
issue.
going to be my discussion. My
Yeah.
question was, if one decides to become, if candidates decide to become a slate, is there a single financial report, or is there three or however many candidates there are on that slate? In addition to the slate report, is there an individual candidate report as well?
Mhm.
Or is it all considered one campaign entity?
There would be basically two reports, or for each candidate, there would be two reports. You would have your own individual campaign report, and then you would also, if you're a member of the slate, there would be the slate report. So, for example, Lauren and I both decide we're going to run for some position, and we decide we're going to be the slate. We're going to be the legal services slate.
Good slate.
A great slate. So we decide we're going to, run together. We each raise $1,000, and then we're going to, have a couple events. So for my individual campaign report and Lauren's, we would each have to report the $1,000 contributions, and then if we wanted to fund the slate, we would have to make, from my individual campaign report, I would have to do a contribution to the slate, and then that would be reported as a contribution to the slate, and then the slate could make joint expenditures. So it is almost like a double, in a sense, a double reporting
Right.
requirement.
Yeah.
So, given that situation, I feel like the purpose of the whole exercise of the reporting is to account to the public for where the money's coming in and where the money's being spent. If that's getting accomplished on individual reports, I don't see what the public gains or what staff gains or what we gain by adding a level of complexity to this reporting with another entity. There's that complication. There are other complications as well. For example, I know because I've run sort of as a slate in two cases. Once with Mike, twice with Kathy.
Yes.
We know.
In both cases, with Mike and with the Kathy campaigns, I raised money individually and expended. Yeah, everything, all of our expenditures were joint expenditures between the two. We split them 50-50. It all came out in the reporting. So the public would have no question about where the money was coming from or what it was being spent on. But then to have to do an additional report, which would just be essentially duplicative information. It would be my money to this other thing and then the expenditure. To me, that doesn't make sense. The other part that can get confusing is if sometimes, for example, I remember there was a time where one of the elections where I was running on a slate with Kathy, and somebody wanted to hold an event for both me and Kathy, but also for Ryan. And in that case, the three campaigns may have accounted for it in some way. We all accounted for it on our individual reports. But we didn't actually have a slate with Ryan. It was really just, it would just add this level of confusion that I don't think is serving the public. So in this case, I agree with the minority on the BOSE in that we should just, the way we should address the confusion is just to get rid of the references to slate in our code and proceed to account for everything the way that we're accounting for it, because it all comes out anyway. That's where I am.
And I think my bottom line or my baseline would be clarity in the code, so that we know what it is and the candidates know what it is. And right now the code refers to not just slate, it also refers to group of candidates as well as candidate team. So you need to be able to scrub the code to make sure the rules are consistent, so that everybody knows or is playing by the same rules. Whether the code says slate or not, or I'm kind of on the fence with respect to that. I would throw out there, if we're going to go the direction of slate, why make it more complicated and adopt our own rules, and why not just adopt the state rules? So the state rules require individual candidates to file as a political committee, and then a slate is a type of political committee. So there's no separate, a slate is a type of political committee. They're not two different entities. So I don't see.
State law does have two different definitions
Yeah.
for them,
Yeah.
because the definitions we use mirror those in state law.
Yeah, and in state law, you can have, a candidate can have the requirement to file their own report, and also the requirement as part of a separate slate to file a slate report.
Yeah, I can guarantee you our definitions are not the same as the state, because I dug into this issue pretty heavily. So at the base, I think clarity is needed. And then whether or not we adopt slates, I mean, I see what Judd's saying as far as adding complexity. If we don't go the slate route, I think we would need clarity, whether it's in the form of regulation or guidelines as to how candidates are to act together. For example, in the state laws, you can do joint authority lines and not slate together, even though the media refers to people as slates. You can do joint authority lines. So just overarching, we need rules that people can follow, that people can understand, the public can understand as they're measuring the candidates.
Anyone else want to weigh in here?
Well, I think if we're even considering not having this as a part of the ordinance, as Robert said, we have to distinguish between what expenditures individuals and groups of candidates can make, whether it's a violation, at what point, at what amount. There has to be more clarity in this area, because working together, pooling money together brings about an advantage. And so we need to be sure that we're, holding our elections and it's a level playing field. And if there is an advantage, that we clarify what that advantage signifies, and that there isn't a violation, or there is, so.
And I think if you look at the proposed code, the language we use, I think it's pretty clear what we're trying to do, and that is address that. Accountability, where the money's coming from, going back to the political committee line to show clearly that's outside money, and then going to the slate showing that that's inside money, but how it's divided and who's teaming with whom. I think it gets a little bit sloppy if we take out all references to it, and it's a little, I don't know if we can have the same accountability, but I do appreciate your point about adding another level of complexity to the reporting. I think it's something we may have to continue looking at, but it was a minority of the group that really suggested removing all references, and I don't know if that serves us.
I'd be amenable to what Rob said about having some sort of guidelines or rules. I don't know if we put guidelines in ordinances, but one way or another, maybe in the candidate packages, just to say that if you are teaming up with another candidate, that there has to be two authority lines, and it has to be as if you're doing it yourself. You have to account for it every bit as much as if you were doing it yourself. Just to take away.
But how do you account for it in your report, your finance report?
Well, for example, like let's say when Mike and I ran, and it was vote for Mike and Judd on the yard sign, and let's say we spent $1,500 on the yard sign. So on my report it would be an expenditure of $750 for yard signs, and he would have $750 on his report as an expenditure for yard signs
But
too.
would it say 50% of a joint purchase, or just $750?
Well,
Probably.
that's how we did it. We split those costs evenly, and we made clear that it was a slate. I think it's different when you have an event, that we were a slate. When you have an event that one candidate sets up and we invite another candidate to join us at the event, that's not an intent. There's no intention there for a slate, and if there are expenses that are incurred that we ask them to share with, then we'll do that and we'll report it. I'll report it as a
Right.
It'll be reported on both of the statements. So
would it be
that's
reported individually or jointly?
It would be reported individually.
But are you saying that it's a joint expenditure that I'm reporting on my individual? Joint expenditure?
Yeah,
that
we'll
Judd's
say,
putting
here's
into-
the total, this is what my campaign contributed, and this is what the other candidate who appeared at the same time contributed. You know, it
But
was.
there's not really a requirement under
We
the
don't
way
even
that
have
the
to do that.
reporting forms are designed to say that. I mean, there's a place where you put a description of what your
Right.
expenditure
Correct.
is.
And I think that's
And
where-
some people voluntarily say, I'm
Say-
doing this as
But
50% of
that's
it.
why there's the slate.
Yeah.
The
But that,
form
look,
the
if I
slate.
schedule an event and I invited somebody else to come to my event and they're another candidate, that doesn't make us a slate.
If
Yeah,
It
you're-
makes
so-
it my
if you're
event in which I've
co-promoting-
invited another candidate.
Co-promoting, co-hosting an event together?
No,
That's
that
not a
wasn't the
joint
purpose of
event?
the event. If I say I'm having an event and, you know, this other candidate is
1, 2,
invited as
3.
well.
But if you're saying candidate A, B, C are hosting an event, then
Yeah.
that sounds like a slate.
Well, I
Rob.
mean, it was, so I think the conversation's good because it points out exactly what the issue is that,
And what the confusion has been.
well, because slate's a loaded term. It's defined by the state, the county defines it as well. You could go to Colorado and they would have slates, but it's not defined, I don't know how they define it
Right.
there. Whatever the case is, as to what parameters we want to set in our elections as to
Clear.
individual and joint campaigning, or if you want to have, it just has to be set in stone as far as I'm concerned. And I think a regulation's the way to go because you, would a.
But you're kind of jumping to
I
our
agree.
next topic, which is
Okay.
regulations.
Well, the point would be is guidelines don't have teeth to them, do
Right.
they?
Right.
So you need a regulation if you were to
Right.
enforce violations?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so, sorry, next
Ryan.
topic.
I just also want to
Yeah.
make the point that I think that what Lorian is getting at is that there's a distinction between accounting and identifying as affiliated with someone else for purposes of supporting each other without necessarily implicating funding. I mean, two people can slate up and say we're endorsing each other and we're going to go out and campaign together and not necessarily spend joint funds. Two people can also spend joint funds and not necessarily say we're endorsing each other and we're going out and working together. So they're kind of two different things.
Yeah.
And I think maybe what you're getting at is whether or not there needs to be some requirement to sort of self-identify as teaming up with someone separate and apart from whether or not you're accounting for the funds. I do get a little concerned about the idea that people would need to do that because, as we've discussed already, this doesn't always fit into, easy, clear-cut boxes of whether or not people are working together or not. I also am a little bit concerned about if there's any sort of First Amendment implications about having to, sort of register my view that I'm slating with this person but not slating with that person, sort of independent from the question of whether or not we're sharing money.
Right.
So I just throw that out there because I think that's a little bit where the issue is. It's sort of a disconnect between the issue of money and accounting and are we affiliated for purposes of the public seeing us running together.
Right.
So-
We're working with the definition, two or more candidates who join together to conduct and pay for joint campaign activities. And versus or, it's written as and. We went over this for a long time. So it's something that clearly we all still need to work on. And it's something that kind of tripped us up the last two elections, so.
Well, I
So
think,
does a slate imply that everything you do is in joint with
Yes.
somebody else?
I think a slate would, but
A slate
then I
does.
think we should take a step back from the word slate and create guidelines or regulations, as Rob says, for joint expenditures. I think that would capture what we're looking for. So the regulation would say if this is a joint expenditure with another candidate, it has to be listed as such in like the description of your financial report in some way, so that it's clear to the public that this was a joint expenditure.
There has to be a joint authority line on the piece.
Yes,
There's
then there has to be a joint authority line.
Well, for a slate or a dual authority line if
Because
it's.
if
It's
more
a
than
dual
one
authority
That's what I
line
mean,
for
right.
separate, yeah.
Dual
which
authority
is,
line, that's what I mean.
I think, yeah.
So if it's more
I
than
don't wanna
one
beat the dead horse.
person contributing to something, does that constitute a slate or
Well,
That would be a joint expenditure.
That's a joint
it's
expenditure.
just a joint expenditure?
Yeah,
It's-
that was my,
So
So what's the difference between a slate and a joint
well, the
expenditure?
slate says you're running together. This is the ticket. The sign says Judd and Mike. It says Judd and Kathy. It says Lorianne and Rob, you know, whatever.
But-
That's what the sign says, that's what the literature says, everything
get
says,
that.
and there's a joint, you know, there's that contribution.
But
line.
there can also be situations,
But-
I know we're sort of beating a dead horse here, sorry, but there can also be situations where two candidates don't necessarily endorse each other, but a third party, let's say a prominent elected official wants to endorse two candidates, and those two candidates don't necessarily team up together, don't necessarily share money with each other generally, but they both want, you know, the prominent official to send out a letter saying that he or she endorses them.
How prominent.
So they can split the cost of the letter and not necessarily be a slate in the sense that they're teamed up more generally.
I think
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, but
So,
I think the definition, the way it was written in the last election, it said any candidate, two or more candidates that pay for campaign expenditures together is considered a slate. So I think.
No,
needs
I
to
don't
be
think that's
clear.
where
I don't think it
doesn't-
says that.
It actually depends what part of the
Where
code you're
you read.
reading. But
And
It
that was
doesn't
part
say
of the
that.
confusion,
That-
by
yeah.
the way, when we were dealing with it, because we were using, I think, part of the definition for political committee. And
Exactly.
obviously, the reason we did this is because we were confronted with a situation and we didn't have a definition.
Yeah.
I think the thing that hits me the most is just, we don't want to create double reporting. We don't want to create, we just want the public to know accurately what's going on financially. You guys will end up having to make a decision about, okay, so what in fact is a slate, okay? And maybe we can deal with that in the regulations regarding a description of when there's payments and that the payments are accurate. Is it split 50-50? Is someone, you know, paying 70? And, but I think that's part of what we were kind of, and what Ty was talking about before was we were kind of
Totally
trying to
understand.
figure out how to deal
Yeah.
with this
Yeah.
situation. And this was the best that we came up with. And
Totally
obviously we
understand.
were waiting for you guys to weigh in and then kind of
So,
go from
so
there.
at the state level, we have our state delegation, the state district delegation and the neighboring one have both decided to form slates.
No, they have not filed for slate committees. That's the confusion with the term, is that they are colloquially referred to as slates, but
Yes.
as a state election entity, there's actually nobody in Montgomery County that's filed as a slate political committee. You can check that on the list. See, that's why there's so many opinions here, is because it really is a loaded term. It really is a quagmire. In fact, the state, in interpreting its own statutes, seems to do it very liberally, where they'll allow, for example, you hop across the border into District 39, where, for all intents and purposes, the respectable delegates have formed a slate, but they use joint authority lines and independent expenditures, and they're not a slate committee.
So really, what we need to get at is transparency in expenditures and
Right.
fundraising, but
Exactly.
not necessarily
And
requiring
clarity,
people to
clarity.
be some sort of an official slate
Right.
and do everything
Right.
together.
Yeah. I think, again, if we just capture what our joint expenditures, we're gonna get at what everybody's trying to get at here. So, go ahead, Lynn.
All right.
You knew that was gonna take a while.
Yeah, I knew that was gonna take a while. So we're gonna jump to, you all have given us a great lead-in into the next issue, which is campaign guidelines versus regulations. In the candidate packets that have been around for a number of years, and we update them every election cycle, there are campaign guidelines. They are guidelines. Guidelines are different than regulations. So really, and I think this one came a little bit more from staff than the BOSC. The recommendation was to change the guidelines to regulations. One, we think that that's going to provide more clarity in the process. I mean, a lot of the things we've just been talking about, and more detail as to the rules of conduct for candidates. It also clarifies enforcement authority in the event of violations. So if we are going to do this, and I think that in your packet we had given just a very sample, we had taken the campaign guidelines and tried to turn those into regulations. If we were going to do that, follow that in total, it would be a much more formal document. I think it would have much more detail. Some of the stuff that's currently in the guidelines would probably become more of a frequently asked questions section versus, this is the rule, because I mean, some of them talk about different examples. Part of the question is, if we're going to have these regulations, who has the authority to adopt the regulations? Certainly the mayor and council have authority to adopt any regulations that you want to under section 2-10 of the code. Or you would have the ability to, under the charter, to delegate that authority to the BOSE to adopt the regulations. I know the board's recommendation is that the mayor and council would retain that authority to adopt the regulations. I'm sure that they would go through, draft them, propose them, submit them to you all with a regulation or with a recommendation, and then you all would be the enforcement authority. So we really just wanted to have feedback. If that was the direction that you wanted us to go, then we would start working through those regulations.
They would be enforcement. We would be regulatory, they would be
enforcement, yes.
The OSC would be
Yes.
enforcement.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just want to clarify.
Yeah.
Yep. So that's something, if there is interest in moving towards that, we would begin the process of sort of drafting those regulations, and certainly we would have a large section on the campaign contributions and the reporting provisions and how all that would work.
Okay.
Sure.
All right, so we did also, in going through our current guidelines and some of our code provisions, had just a couple of these are just kind of more kind of clarification issues that came up in this election. One was the use of the city logo or seal in campaign materials. We think that should be prohibited. You shouldn't be able to use the G logo. I think we've always thought that was kind of common sense, but again, it's not anywhere in the current guidelines. So that would be something we would propose in the regulations.
What if you turn it into a C?
Well, that's part of
which
the
was a
question.
great logo, by the way.
Yeah.
But it was, okay.
I mean,
So
I
derivatives
admit
would be
we had
derivatives.
some complaints about that, but again, we didn't have any enforcement authority because we didn't have a rule that said you couldn't do it.
Yeah.
So.
As much as I think the rule makes sense, I'm a little concerned about, what are the boundaries of our authority with respect to the First Amendment. Lynn, you and I have talked a little bit preliminarily about the idea of can a government trademark a logo? Right. I think it can. That's something to think about.
Yeah.
But I just want to be careful as we tread on this into this area. I think there's room for regulation here, but I think we have to just not overreach because we just do have to be sensitive to the idea that, a lot of this, there is no purer form of speech than political speech.
Right.
Candidates running for office obviously, can be regulated, but it has to be within the bounds of the Constitution, obviously. So, just want to make.
I'm with Ryan on that.
Folks, be aware of that.
That in terms of the city logo and seal, I think if we created a guideline as opposed to a regulation on that it would solve. It would be an improvement from where we're at, and we can see if it's enough.
Well, the other thing to do would be to trademark the logo and seal, so that it couldn't be used.
That wouldn't be
for that
easier than making this into a guideline.
Well, and some of them,
I'm not so sure about that, quite frankly.
I think it'd probably be easier.
Well, and probably, what most people don't really realize is the G with the tree is a logo. It's not our city seal, and we could clearly trademark the logo.
The logo.
It's really a question with the city seal, which I don't think people have really. Most people don't even know what that is. So,
Right.
I don't think we've had a lot of use of that. So,
But you also get, through use, the trademark under the Lanham Act. You don't have.
Common law and statutory.
Correct.
trademark.
You don't. But
Right.
Well,
So my
Unless
point here
the
would
city
be,
hasn't been
for
enforcing
this point, as well as for
That's
the use
right.
of title
A lot
and
of people have been
position,
using it, and then it's
my
gone.
druthers would be
Couple
that whatever candidates and however they use it, it's not to confuse people into thinking it's an official
yes.
Right.
city document or city whatever it may be. That would be my biggest concern.
Okay. And then the other one was presence in the polling places. We did have a little bit of issue on election day as to who's entitled to be in the polling place and who's not. So we wanted to just put a little bit of clarification around that issue as well.
Can I ask you about the middle bullet, which
Sure.
kind of got lumped together with
Yeah.
the discussion of the first bullet, but I think it deserves a separate discussion.
Yeah.
I am also concerned about this one for the same reasons, because, if I'm running for re-election and I say, re-elect council member Ryan Spiegel, and you tell me the regulations do not allow you to use the word council member, it gets really tricky.
Like,
It's a
what are
gray
you
area.
running
It's
for?
like, well, what are you running for? B, can you put your bio on something that say
Right.
I've been a council member for 10 years?
Yeah.
I mean, at what point do you? I understand. I agree with Rob. We certainly want to do what we can to avoid confusion, to avoid any suggestion that the government has put its imprint
Sure.
on somebody's candidacy or endorse them, which obviously the government doesn't do. But at the same time, I think we just need to be careful.
But I think you also want to make sure that candidates don't use the title or position when it's not true.
Yeah, I think,
Right.
And I think
Right.
that's more of the issue.
I
is
think it's a
that-
de facto issue.
Right.
I mean, I think
And-
to run to what you're talking about, if you are a council member,
You are a
you get to
council
use
member.
the title,
Right.
okay? Believe it or not, there are some benefits to incumbency, okay?
Yeah.
You can't make everything exactly perfect. And
Right.
I've had to deal with this because I've dealt with union elections for over 12 years.
Sure.
Thousands of elections. We dealt with union logos. So to your point, which is if you're a council member, you get to say you're a council member. And so that's the way to deal with the particular example that you gave. If you're not a council member, you shouldn't be able to use the word council member before your name because it leads to confusion. The person isn't a council member.
So this was an issue with the state ethics legislation that used a similar
Right.
prohibition that included people who were incumbents,
Mm-hmm.
which I thought would easily be challenged,
Right.
as a First
Well, and this
Amendment
was
issue,
something
so-
when the State
Right.
Ethics Commission was adopting its latest round of regulations, we did go and talk with them, and we were able to get them, at least for local governments, not to include that as a provision that was applicable to local governments. So at least currently under state law, it is still permissible for local government members, if they are incumbents, to use their title in
Right.
their campaign.
we're looking to clarity with the middle bullet, we're not looking to prohibit.
Right.
in
Right.
your-
Right.
Exactly.
I would commend to you the federal ethics regulation. So even in my campaign literature, I could put senior attorney, U.S. Government Accountability Officer, Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Army. I would just have to make sure there's no confusion. So usually what happens there is you put an asterisk and you put a little byline on the bottom saying, doesn't
Not
endorse
endorsed,
by the
right.
federal government or
Mhm.
whatever.
Sure.
Or Mike can put like, he's a director at the NIH, but he'd have to put the same little asterisk and, to avoid the confusion. or
For
dispel-
identification purposes only, right,
Yeah.
something like that.
It might be a fair compromise if the council wants that,
Which compromise?
to, as a
Look,
guideline or a regulation,
I
that
think-
the asterisk needs to be there.
I think there's, I think there's common sense, and I think that there's other things that we do and regulate. I think this one's common sense. I've never used my position in the federal government as part of my campaign. It's part of my biography. That's it. Some people have suggested I use my PhD after my name. That has nothing to do with me being on the council either, so.
Yeah, but you might use
but
council member.
I use, but I don't even know if probably in some cases I've used council member, in other cases reelect me, reelect implies that I'm an incumbent, so I don't worry about that part. It's not about my title, it's about what I have to offer as a candidate, so, but I think there are cases where people have used and implied that they're already in that office.
There's been
That was the
confusion.
So,
issue.
and there's
That
been
was the issue.
confusion.
I mean, I would-
That was the issue.
Yes.
I would be in favor of broad regulation saying that you shall not use title or position
Which
to
you're not holding.
confuse or imply endorsement. Then in the guide, you put some kind of
Some examples.
examples, and then we would leave
Mhm.
it to the discretion of those as to whether or not it's been violated or not.
That's what we're looking for.
Right.
Okay.
That's
All
gonna
right.
be tricky. It's
Yeah.
gonna be tricky
Yeah.
to
I agree.
enforce. It's gonna be there's gonna be a lot of gray areas. I'm just,
Well, you can't call yourself something that you aren't.
Right.
Now, voters will decide whether or not that's an issue that they want to deal with, but I think it's fair to regulate this
Right.
to some extent.
All right, go ahead, Lee.
The other issue was debates. We wanted to update the criteria for organizations that can host debates. You all are probably aware that we had several requests for debates in the 2017 election, and the BOSC just thought there needed to be some clarification around the definition of who was eligible to hold a debate. The other issue is our current debate policy, and again, it's our debate guideline, they are guidelines only, did require that all candidates had to be invited to a debate, where other jurisdictions allow separate mayoral versus, council candidates. So we wanted to be able to at least have the options to split those out, particularly if you have a large number of candidates running. Sometimes it's difficult to do both the mayoral and the council member debates at the same time. So again, we were looking for a little bit of clarity around those issues.
So are we keeping the authority of who can approve or deny a forum to the Board of Supervisors?
Well, not a forum. I mean, any person can hold a forum, but for debates, that would be within the BOSC's authority to approve.
These are
Well,
only
no,
debates
these
that
only
take
be
place
televised
here.
Here and
Yeah.
televised.
Okay.
So anybody can invite people to a forum or debate.
In any
'Cause
combination.
I think there was confusion about, the ones that would be advertised. So even if it's not being held here, for the city to advertise, whose
Yeah, I mean,
discretion is
any
that?
organization that approached us, we had told them that we would put out, dates and places for forums. Again, we don't endorse those in any way. We don't, but we would add those to our calendar, our website calendars if, we did get information. And I think we did that with the Catlins Group's debate, Asbury, I mean, the ones that we generally get, we would at least put the dates and the times, and the locations on the city calendar.
But some of the debates were canceled.
Correct, and that was because the Board of Supervisors of Elections found that they were not in accordance with the policy.
And they were going to be hosted here?
Yes, they were going to be televised here at City Hall. I mean,
So-
we did also update some of the language to allow us a little bit more flexibility because as we build the new council chambers, it might not be at City Hall, so we did add some flexibility in that language as well, as where they could be held.
What prohibits the city from putting on a debate? And I don't know the answer. I was looking for the answers. I noticed that Rockville, Tacoma Park, they don't do it.
They don't do
but
it, yeah.
other jurisdictions do it. So is there something that prohibits it?
There is nothing that prohibits it. I mean, I think the
Appearance of
problem
conflict.
then again, it's like, who do you get to host? The way that our system works is the organization that hosts the debate, I mean, they pick the moderator, the people asking questions. The Board of Supervisor Elections has the authority to stop the debate at any time if they think it's, kind of going off track, so it's not fair. But the BOSC doesn't approve the moderator, doesn't approve questions in advance, any of that kind of stuff. It is truly an independent debate. If the city hosted it, then you always have the question of, have they picked somebody who's biased one side to the other? Have they planted certain questions? Is the moderator impartial? And I think that's generally why jurisdictions don't do the debate. I mean, we did pull debate policies from a number of jurisdictions around the state, and most of them are very similar to what ours is. I think, fortunately for Rockville, they seem to have a little bit more energized citizens groups who want to hold these debates, where we've struggled in the past and we've tried to do some outreach in the past, and we've just not really been very successful in attracting organizations that have wanted to hold the debates here.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
After you.
I was going to go back to the first point in terms of the definition of the organization, that the proposed changes to that language look good to me.
I
So
think so, yeah, I agree.
I mean, if we want to hold debates in the city, and I think they're important to our democracy, I think at the very least, the updates to criteria to allow for more proactive assistance from the city, as well as who can and can't host debates, criteria like that, more outreach would be more beneficial, because as it stands here.
What do you mean
well,
proactive, though? I don't understand the point. I mean, the city has a policy for how we allow them to happen on our facilities.
Which would be
that's it.
passive. If the
It's
city
passive?
if the city were, for example, so if the city's rules are come to us, and if you ask, we might approve your debate, that's exceedingly passive. If the city were to, for example, to take the position of, well, let's go see what organizations might be interested in hosting a debate. And there are many local organizations that are nonpartisan.
No, but then you introduce the appearance of conflict again. If the city goes out and contacts certain people and say,
Poaching people.
we think you should hold a debate,
Well,
and we
contact
will offer
every
the
person.
venue. and-
Put it
Or
out
I
there
think
that
we
it's-
should just have the criteria right on the
criteria.
website, on the
It's there.
election website.
It's
of
there.
what-
It's there now.
But there's broad flexibility for any entity to host a forum.
Right. Anybody
Inviting
can.
whoever they want, asking whatever sorts of questions, including one that was conducted last cycle via email.
Email for it?
there
Oh, the
was a
Sierra Club sent out a
questions were sent out
questionnaire.
and
Oh.
questions were returned, which actually gave a much more in-depth answers than you may get in an off-the-cuff in person.
Well, of course, the Sierra Club's email was the B plan to the canceled debate, but my point is just that if we want to take the position of debates are important and fostering that dialogue, the status quo does not work for Gaithersburg. It may work for Rockville, where, as you said, Lynn, they have a more robust political scene. But here, if it is as it is, we're not going to have debates.
No,
we
I
haven't
think-
had debates since 2009, so that has to speak for something.
It speaks to the fact that there aren't organizations, and perhaps the time issue as well, but there aren't organizations that have been independent of any candidate that can be able to offer the forum where the debate could be held, or offer the services to hold a debate on behalf of their organization for all of the candidates. That's what it speaks to. So if you as an individual council member want to go out and promote the idea and drum up the interest, then I mean that's what you should do. I think that separates it from what the city should do.
I also think there's an issue here of technology and logistics. There was a time not that long ago when the opportunity to have an organized debate televised because you came to City Hall was a big deal. But now anybody with an iPhone can televise a debate,
Right.
so or a forum if it's not formally through the city. So it becomes a lot easier to host these various forums, and I think we saw that even with the the Kentlands Forum, which I attended. I thought was a great, whether you want to call it a forum or debate, whatever, a great event. And I know that it was broadcast online, and there were a fair number of people who were actually keyed in to I don't know if it was listen or watch the debate, but they didn't need the technological infrastructure of the camera system at City Hall in order to do that. So I think if we're putting it out there, and one of the big value propositions to organizations was, oh, you get a venue and it gets televised. Well, if they've got another venue somewhere that's more convenient to them and they can televise or broadcast it or record it on their own, then that might be one of the reasons why we see a little bit less demand these days. It could be. And if candidates are willing to go out to the community to where people are, then maybe more and more people are going to say, well, I don't need to organize something at City Hall. But I got to tell you, I appreciate your enthusiasm, Rob, for trying to come up with something creative to get more formal debates. But I still have a lot of concerns that there's no good way to execute a proactive approach without continuing to have those conflict of interest principles, because you end up, even if you're not really doing it on purpose, you have the appearance of picking favorites among organizations and saying, organization A, come on, why don't you guys do it? And then somebody out there in the public says, well, why did you guys go to organization A first instead of organization B?
You do it exactly as you. Wait, sorry, didn't mean.
No, and that's I'm not sure there's a way around that, even if it's under the best of intentions.
Well, I appreciate you appreciating me.
I appreciate that.
Appreciation. This is very meta.
But so we could do proactive steps that are not biased. It's for example, how we go out and procure stuff. You engage the market, the vendors. You say, hey, we're interested in buying this. Well, we did. Hey, we're interested in you hosting a debate, and you just do it to the entire field. I mean, we do have some great forums that go on here. The Kentlands is a perennial favorite. Asbury's a perennial favorite. I can count the rest on these fingers right here. And it just so happens that those organizations are in communities that have higher turnout than the rest of the city. So if we want to engage in civic discourse, increase voter turnout, we need to think of ways to engage the public, particularly in areas that we don't engage the public. And we saw the excellent graphics that represent that. And this is just one of the mechanisms for us to do so, is to provide forums for civic discourse.
All right, so I think we should table this particular debate until we're working on our communication strategy, because this is really something we should work on with Britta. We're not going to enshrine this. We'll enshrine sort of the guidelines and the policies in law or regulation. But other than that, this is communication strategy stuff. So go ahead, Lynn.
Okay. The next issue is recount. There was some discussion amongst the board during this election. If we had a request for a recount, we have no provision or authority in the code to do that. So the question was, even if a recount was requested, would they be able to do one? So we did, certainly take a look at the number of other municipalities, and most other municipalities have recount provisions in their code. So again, the board is recommending that we add a recount section. There are a couple of questions, and again, we did provide a draft one in there, but some jurisdictions allow a recount only if there is a small margin. Usually it's between 0.5% and 1%. So what that would mean in the 2017 election, if we used, Rockville uses the 0.5%, for our election that would be a margin of 17 votes or less for our last election. If we did 1%, it would go up to 35 if we round. The other question is cost. We did talk to our vendor because we would need the new memory cards and the equipment in order to conduct the recount. So the cost of doing a recount, assuming all of our BOSC members don't get the big bucks, so they and staff are cheap. It's really the equipment cost. So our cost of a recount would be somewhere between $1,500 and $5,000. Most jurisdictions do require, if the recount, whoever requests the recount, if it turns in their favor, most jurisdictions say that the city eats the cost for that recount. But if it does not turn in their favor, that they have to pay for the cost. And then some jurisdictions do require people to post a bond for those costs because they don't want to get to the position of, you just cost us $5,000 and we're telling you to pay, and then you can't pay, or you don't pay. So those are, if we want to include recount provision in our code, I think those are some of the issues that we would need to look at being able to address in the ordinance.
So when running a campaign in the city of Gaithersburg could cost between, say, $5,000 and $10,000 in a typical campaign year, asking somebody to potentially pay $5,000 for a recount seems kind of onerous. I would think that I would be in favor of a regulation that says that if the margin is within some small amount, that the city would do a recount. Just like if there's a touchdown in the Super Bowl, they automatically re-examine it. I think we want to do the same sort of thing.
Upon request. I mean, if somebody wants to concede, I don't know that we would, need to do an automatic recount if they don't want to do it, but.
But I think just having to, even if it's $1,500, that just seems like a lot for an election of this type.
Do we know what a recount would cost?
Lorianne?
We just did.
She just said
$5,000 is.
Yeah.
Well, we looked at between $1,500 and $5,000. It's kind of the estimate.
So
Okay, hold on, Lorianne.
So have we had an issue with or a request for a recount, why we want to include?
We haven't for a long time, and Joan, you might have more background material or experience. I mean, I do remember, again, I don't remember. I have heard stories, because it was before my time here, that, there were several city elections a number of years ago where, the vote difference was 1 or 2 votes. Now, I don't know if they formally did a recount for those elections.
Yeah, how close was yours, Judd, the first time around?
First, I lost by 44 votes in '05. Ryan just privately asked, would I have asked for a recount? I would not have done it.
So in that same election,
what happens when it happens?
Henry's lost by like 3 votes.
That was the issue.
Yeah, in that re-election in 2005, Henry was behind before the absentee ballots were counted, and then he ended up being elected by a 10-vote margin over the third candidate. So my question is before you report the actual vote count, how many times are those votes counted upstairs or wherever you guys do? They counted more than once to verify the count?
We do, and again, we're going to talk about election equipment in a few minutes, but the equipment that we currently use, and I think any equipment we do use, there is the ability to triple check the information. There is a memory card in each of the scanners. So we do run, or actually we don't, our vendor runs all of the memory cards to tabulate that information. There's also the tape in each machine. that has the information. So we tabulate the tapes, we tabulate the memory cards, we make sure that those numbers are the same. And then we also have the ability to actually count we obviously have paper ballots as well.
Paper ballots, right.
So there's 3 ways to verify the same information. And again, if we did a recount, we would go back through, all 3 of those systems
Right.
to ensure that the numbers
But on the
matched
night
up.
before, and on the night, when you go up and do the count,
Mm-hmm.
and you report the number, how many times is the total vote counted?
3.
And 3 times before you report it. So you're
Correct.
pretty confident that each time there is no variation, no more than, is there ever
Or are there?
variation?
Yeah,
And if
that's
there
a good
is, then
Yeah, I
it
mean,
would
we
seem
have,
like you would count them a 4th time
Yeah.
if the third one came out
Correct.
different.
yeah.
So, I mean, that's already 3 times you counted them. I would say that but if there was, I agree with Neil that it's an onerous thing, and there are areas, well, I guess most places, states and counties have an automatic recount at a certain percentage. And, the locality or the government jurisdiction eats that and does it automatically. And I would have no problem with that. I think if someone requests a recount outside of that automatic recount, then they should understand the costs.
So
That would be my suggestion.
What's BOS's rationale in the
Yeah.
recommendation for a recount? I mean,
we don't have
it's
anything.
so is it just the fact that there is not one?
Yeah, I think it's the fact
Right.
that there
There's
is not
nothing in
one.
the
Right.
rules
There's
about-
no-
about
There's nothing in the
Right.
code.
No.
Okay.
Yeah, and, again,
so
we
it's
did look.
preventive.
And clearly, elections have become quite contested around the country. We want to be prepared. We don't want to just stand there and shrug when someone says, I want to recount. What's the regulations?
That makes sense.
Cost aside, we can work out the cost, but I think we really need some language on how we
Right.
conduct a contested election and at what margin.
Well, I agree, it makes sense to limit these potential recounts to where it's very close. I mean, it's hard to anticipate somebody, if you've lost by a lot, why would you want it recounted? I don't know, but just to create that guideline, I think makes sense.
So Lynn, what would be the difference between the triple check and the recount? Would it be the same methodology?
It would be the same methodology.
That's why I don't have a problem with an automatic recount at a certain percentage. I think we'd have to decide on what that would be, but, And like I said, if you count it 3 times and the numbers aren't the same all 3 times, then, there's something else you gotta look for. But that hasn't happened as far as I know.
I mean, I would, hearkening back to what Neil was saying, I think I would disagree given the amount of precision you're articulating in our counting system is that if somebody wants to challenge it on a recount, I think because of the precision we've had and the accuracy and the fidelity, that I would want the cost to be borne by the person requesting the recount.
I think we found that it was helpful to have a percentage because, to address the mayor's concern, a sore loser situation, okay? Wide margins, and they still request a recount. That's just waste.
Right.
We don't see a great benefit to having a recount if, especially based on the system we have, huge margins, why do that?
Right.
Okay, so the only mechanism would be a recount when within a percentage,
Within
not the
a-
ability to request.
Within a
Okay.
small
That's-
number.
yeah.
Also, if we are going to establish a recount regulation, I think we should also incorporate a deadline by when someone should request
Yes.
or can
Yeah.
request a recount.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was discussed.
So,
Did
I
you
agree.
guys provide us with a recommendation on that?
Yeah,
on time?
there is a draft recount ordinance in your packet. Now, it does not deal with the margins and the cost in the bond issue. It's general, and it has a
Deadline?
it has a deadline. I wanted to say it was within 2 days, but I have to admit, I don't remember.
Well, that raises another question, which, I've talked with Judd and others about over the years, is
Yeah, it is within 2 days, yeah.
the speed with which we swear people in after an election has pros, but it also has some cons. And we might need to think about, if we're going to have a recount provision, building in a little bit of extra time between the time of the election and the time of the swearing in of the victors, because that's a bit of an issue if you're, you know, I mean,
Right.
it takes a little time to actually do it.
Well, do you guys feel guided enough with the feedback you've
Yeah,
gotten?
I think that, I
Okay.
think we
would seem-
do.
All right, you can provide us with a couple of options on costs, but I
All
think other than that, we're pretty.
Yeah, I think it's, yeah, so to Ryan's point, I think there has to be a time limit to request, but also a time limit to complete the
Right. I
recount.
I think the time
So-
limit that was discussed was either 1 or 2 days
It's 2
after,
days, yeah, 2 days. After the
After
certification.
certified results.
after the certified
Certified,
result
yeah.
was given.
Yeah.
Right.
I have
How
a
long does
question
your
about
count
the-
usually take?
Oh,
How long does the official count take?
About
The
an hour.
official-
Yeah.
about an hour.
Yeah.
So the recount would take,
If we have the equipment still, then it
okay.
will.
A
So-
recount would take longer.
So this is a recount of the certified results and not the
Correct,
recount
with
of the
certified.
preliminary results?
Yes, correct.
So I have a
And we don't
question
see the
about the
certified
cost.
results for a week.
Because every ballot would
Yeah,
have
yeah,
to
the
be
certified- the-
rescanned.
Yeah, the board
okay.
certifies the results. Their current practice, the charter says they have to certify the results within 48 hours of the election. Their practice has been to meet the Wednesday after. They usually do it within 24 hours after the election. But again, they would have up to 2 days to do that under the charter. I'm not saying we can't extend that time under the charter, but that's what the current charter provision
Neil.
says.
Thank you. I have a question about the cost. I mean, realistically, what would make me feel comfortable in a recount situation would be, I mean, we only get 3,000 or so votes.
Right.
To take the paper ballots and have somebody look through them one by one by one by one. How
Right.
long would that take? 3,000 is not a really huge number.
Yeah, no, I mean, generally what we would do is we would set up a time, you know, for the board to do that. Obviously, that would be open to the public, so the public could observe them going through that process.
No hanging
Um,
chads.
Generally, and I think Bill has experience with this on the labor side, you know, you have like, you know, 2 people looking at one stack, and then, you know, you make sure that they have numbers. If their numbers don't match, then, you know, you bring in a third person. So, I mean, I think it can be done
In that case,
fairly.
the cost is not really
Yeah,
significant.
it's really the cost is in the equipment if we still have the machines. It's not really in the people and the time.
And the Bows requested it, and it would be their labor
Mhm.
ultimately,
Correct.
so.
No, it's one of the candidates request a recount.
Well, the Bows requested the
The-
proposal for.
Yeah,
recount.
we're requesting.
Oh, yeah.
it.
Right.
That it be in the
We're counting.
regulations.
But I wouldn't always make the assumption there are only going to be 3,000 people voting. I think we need to.
Right, we're hoping
Hope
to.
it's going to
Yeah.
get bigger.
Yeah.
Okay, go on to the next.
Go ahead,
thing. We're
next
good.
one.
Then we had a number of provisions that really are just kind of clarifications in the ordinance, going in and through and cleaning up some of the language in the ordinance. The most important one in here, I think, to discuss is section 6C10, which is the penalty provision, and this is for late filings of campaign reports. And our current law says that if you don't file a campaign report within 2 days of the due date, you're removed from the ballot. It's not you may, it's you shall be removed from the ballot. I think the BOSC thought that that was a little stringent, and they wanted to have a little bit more leeway in there because, I mean, they think that that's a pretty draconian remedy to a solution, and there may be some extenuating circumstances to why it was not filed. So I think that they were looking at changing the shall to may, and then also putting a fine in there so they would have the authority to either fine or remove the name from the ballot, but it would give them some discretion.
How about number of violations? as
Yeah, I mean,
part
that
of
may be
consideration?
something as well. I mean, they don't want to be in a position if you're going to say, well, I'm never going to file a campaign report, you know, then obviously your name shouldn't be on the ballot. But if you have, you know, one late where you filed, you know, 2 days and 1 hour late once, but everything else was on time, they think, you know, that's probably a situation where they would find somebody versus remove their name from the ballot.
Can I just, I generally agree with that concept, and I do think we shouldn't have an outsized punishment for that, but I would want to ensure that there's consistency
Yeah.
in the way, you know, one candidate and another candidate are treated for similar
Sure,
violations.
absolutely.
And so if we're going to say may, we might want to figure out how to word it in a way that, you know, make sure that, well, we may do it, so with this candidate, and I'm not talking about the current Bows, but maybe some future Bows,
Sure.
you know, would want to say, you know, for this candidate, we're going to kick them off the ballot, but for that candidate, we're going to give them a slap on the wrist.
Right.
We want to make sure we don't do that.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So is this the only area of the election code that provided such a draconian, like I saw this too, and I was like, well, it's-
Yeah.
Okay, so-
I mean, if you file a campaign report late, even if it's like 1 minute late, there is a $100 fine, but that one is a May. And I mean, the board's past practice is the first time they give you a warning, the second time they issue the fine. And then there are a number of other provisions that if there is a violation, it becomes a municipal infraction, so that they may impose a fine up to $1,000 and take, you know, injunctive relief and other remedies. This was really the only one that was kind of the, you know, you shall do this and you have no discretion, no discretion here. And then really the rest of these are just kind of, you know, clean up language here and there within the ordinances to provide a little bit more clarity.
On section 6C, are we done with the penalty?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, 6C22.
Mm-hmm.
Absentee ballots must be received by close of the polls on election day.
Yes.
Given the problem that we have with the Postal Service, I have no problem with the ballot being counted as long as it was postmarked on election day and mailed. But this goes to the issue of when are all of the votes finally tallied.
Right.
That's the
Right.
problem.
Right.
If they're received within 2 days of election, then, you know, that it would seem like that would be reasonable. Now, given the number of absentee ballots we have, it's actually significant compared to the turnout. So you don't want to lose any of those votes that are cast.
No.
And there is an expectation that the post office will do something in a certain amount of time. But it's clear if it's postmarked before the election or on the day of the election, we know the intent of the voter to comply.
Yeah.
So I would say we should include those ballots and determine how long we'll accept them after the election.
But then we get to the concern
When do you
about
certify?
Yes.
A, when to certify, and B, what happens if you're basically treating two identical ballots differently because they arrived at a different time at no fault of the voter, right?
Right.
Two voters,
Well, and I think that's-
both postmark a ballot on election day. One of the ballots arrives 2 days later, another one arrives a week later for whatever crazy reason, and that one doesn't get counted. It's sort of not fair to the voters. So that's why I actually prefer having the language be about when it's received.
Me too.
Yes.
Even though I know it creates it makes it a little bit more of a burden for the voter than the other way around. But I just think that there's too much inconsistency that's possible there. So
We wanted some
reason to
certainty, and just to the issue, postmarked on the same date, it could be a week later.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't know, and so we wanted to say, based on our experience, okay, we want a cutoff, we want to have received it. So
I think if you're going to vote absentee, it's incumbent upon you to
Right.
give it enough lead time. Just
Right.
like if you're going to drive to work and there might be traffic, you want to leave a little bit early.
Right.
I mean, you just have to account for that in that
Right.
situation.
Yeah, but what if you're a military guy stationed in Djibouti or something?
That was
But-
another reason to extend the
Expand the
time.
Right.
right. So now you have 60 days instead of 30 days to get
So
it.
now you
Yeah.
get 60
That was
days.
part of the law.
Yeah, I'm kind of with Mike here. I mean, in law practice, it's called the mailbox rule, aptly named, that as long as it's postmarked prior to, and it's, so.
But then that interferes with the final
Certification.
tally of the vote.
Well, you could set an end date. It would essentially be a grace period. It says as long as it's postmarked by election date
Friday.
and received within 48 hours, 72 hours, whatever the case may be, so that it'll allow some kind of grace period for the
Later.
postal service to.
And
Then
that's
we
gonna
really-
have to change the code for the time that we
Certified.
determine the certification.
And also
Exactly.
swearing in, because it's gonna now narrow that one
Yeah,
down too.
push everything out,
It creates too
potentially.
many other hassles and problems.
Yeah. I'm on the other side of this one.
I am too, and there are some jurisdictions that don't use the post office rule the same way.
So if we extend the time, that gives them an extra, at least 25 days, if the applications go out and come back.
And we can
But they
send-
have to get it in, and if the notice is posted, they'll know they have to get it in before the close of the polls
Well, so this,
on election day.
yeah, and so in a way, that's why I asked about the ballot tracks providing reminder emails to people who have received absentee ballots
Right.
that you have this many days to return your ballot. Now, but people can apply for an absentee ballot basically up to the day before the election,
Sure.
correct? And
Yeah, I
so-
mean,
But
we
then
have
they can
people-
also bring it back to the election poll
Yeah.
or to City Hall.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we
In person.
have people who
person.
kind of walk them through within one day. They come in here and they physically get it. We approve the application, then we give them a ballot, and they vote when they want to, basically. So, I mean, we try to be as accommodating as we can for any voter in that situation. And Joan is correct, we do accept them at the polling places. You can drop them off at City Hall. We have a number of ways to get those back to us and get them back on a timely basis.
All right.
All right. We talked a little bit about the election equipment. We have used the AccuVote election equipment for a number of years. It is getting a little dated. We did get notice from our vendor that they are having more trouble maintaining the systems because they're getting old. So we will probably be looking at new equipment for the next year, but it will basically be the same type of equipment. It will be a scanner, it will have the memory card, it will have the tape, it will have the paper ballots. So it may be new equipment, but it will be basically the same type of system. So certainly we will set up a demonstration for our BOSC to take a look at the equipment and to make sure that they are okay with it. The board is probably aware we had a few technical issues with our equipment this election. I mean, it functioned fine on election day. It wasn't, there was no problems with regard to accuracy. But we did have a few little trouble getting some of the equipment, up and running, and I think that is just due to the age of the equipment. Our vendor was very busy making sure that everything was up and running and accurate before Election Day.
So are you getting the equipment from the same vendor, or are you putting out an RFP?
We do an RFP every
Okay.
election, so we would be doing that this election as well. There are really, unfortunately, very few vendors who actually have the type of equipment. We will only use equipment that's certified by both the federal government and the state of Maryland for elections, and we've primarily dealt with two vendors in the last 5-10 election cycles, again, because there are not that many who actually provide the equipment. We did want to implement some of this stuff. I'll go through fairly quickly because I know we're getting a little late, but we did want to implement a new program for the next election. This is based, modeled after a Montgomery County program, which is a student election aid program, which would allow students to come in and get some SSL hours where they would be able to participate in election activities. We think this is a great opportunity to get our youth involved in the election process, and then also to provide a little bit more help at the polls on election days. So we'll be exploring that. Voter turnout, always a really tough issue, and I don't know that we will solve that this evening, but in 2017, we did have election booths at a number of city festivals. We were at Summerfest, we were at Oktoberfest. I think this is an older picture from the Labor Day parade. We have expanded our election marketing plan, and there's a copy of that plan that was in your background materials, but in this past election we spent over $30,000 in marketing our elections. A lot of that, unfortunately, is mailing costs, mailing both the voter guide, which does go bulk, but the sample ballot polling place does go first class mail. I mean, that mailing alone costs about $17,000 to produce and mail. But we are certainly open for kind of any suggestions that you may have with regard to increasing voter turnout. We did just provide a chart here to kind of show some of our historic voter turnout. Again, I think 2013 was the anomaly because that was a completely uncontested election, so it's surprising we even got 5.4% of our citizens to come out and vote for that. But generally the trend is we always have higher voter turnout in a contested mayoral election.
Yep.
And then it goes down in years that we don't have that contested mayoral election. But certainly we want to look at strategies to make these numbers bigger and better. We did just want to throw out a couple other just topics. Again, I don't know that we're going to go in great detail on these this evening, but we at least wanted some feedback of if these are issues you would like us to explore. The first being voting by mail. The board looked at voting by mail probably about 4 years ago, and at that point, really the only place in the country that they did it was Oregon. And at that point, I think the board kind of thought this is kind of too new, kind of too untested. Don't really know if we want to explore that. But it now has been implemented in Oregon, Washington, and Colorado. Colorado has a little bit of a hybrid where you both vote by mail, but then they have voting centers where you can go in and vote in person as well. Of course, that increases the cost when you do it both ways. Some of our board members attended a forum that was hosted by the City of Rockville back in September, where a gentleman from the Federal Elections Commission spoke about voting by mail, as well as representative of the Montgomery County Board of Elections. The city of Rockville is very actively looking at voting by mail. In fact, they had a public hearing this past Monday night to talk about this, and I know that they're having another meeting on April 9th. I'm not sure if they will move forward with it for their 2019 election, although they did talk about in 19 possibly having a referendum on the ballot to see if they would implement it in 2023. But again, this is an issue that, I think the board will continue to take a look at. Based on studies that I have seen, it generally does increase turnout, although probably not as significantly as you would think. But it also generally increases cost. So, I think those are kind of two things that we would, take a look at, and we can certainly provide you all more information if you think that this is something that we should at least pursue or to look into to bring back additional information. The other issue is same-day voter registration. This is something, that, again, that Rockville allows, where if you are not registered to vote, you can come to the polling place on election day, register to vote, and then vote. You would obviously vote by provisional ballot because we would have to verify whether you are eligible to be a voter. So that would be handled as a provisional ballot. I don't know that we get very many requests from people. We do have a number of people who do vote provisional ballot. By provisional ballot, I think we had 46 this last election, and 25 of those 46 were either not city residents or were not registered to vote, or sometimes they were both. We did have one individual who was not 18. They were registered to vote, but they had not reached the age of 18. But the rest either were not city residents or they were not registered to vote. So if we did allow voter registration, we may pick up a few more votes, but I don't know if it would be a significant impact on our voter turnout.
So what's the difference between an absentee ballot and voting by mail?
There really is. It works pretty much the same way. So if you vote by mail, everyone who is a registered voter would get a ballot in the mail. So obviously we would want to time that with your voter guide and all those kind of things, so you would have that information all at the same time.
So there's the extra mailing expense and printing expense to the city. Yep. That would go with that.
Yeah. Most jurisdictions do use something similar to ballot tracts, but there's also your envelope your ballot is bar coded, so we can verify that the things that we're sending out are also the ones that we're getting back in. It does take a little bit more staff time because you have to verify signatures, because there is obviously not signature on the ballot, but signature on the application that comes back with the ballot. They have found in jurisdictions that if you mail it out and don't include a self-addressed stamped envelope, it really has no impact on your voter turnout. If you include that stamp, it does tend to increase your voter turnout. And then if you do what Colorado has done, where you have kind of the hybrid option of everybody gets mailed a ballot, but you can either mail it back or they have voting centers where you can bring them back in, or you can come to the voting center and actually vote.
Yeah, I was going to ask that. So there's still polling places on Election Day in Oregon and
no.
Washington? There aren't, right?
No.
So it's the voting centers where you can bring your ballot back.
Right. There would
That's
probably
in Colorado.
In Colorado.
In Colorado, it'd probably be
I don't know what they do
for
in Oregon.
Gaithersburg, there would probably be one centralized location, probably City Hall, where you could come in and do that. Some of them just also have boxes outside in places that obviously the boxes are secured, where you can. Colorado had one where you could bicycle through and drop off your. And this is only in Colorado, where you could bicycle through and drop off your ballot.
Do you have any of the numbers from when they implemented the voting by mail from before? What the numbers were, the turnout numbers?
Yeah, I do. We do have those. I don't have those with me this evening, but we have put a lot of information. These are the 3 states that have done it statewide. There also are a few municipalities that have done it, not in this area, but kind of in the Midwest, I think in Iowa and a couple other places where there are some municipalities. So we do have some research and some information on that we could certainly bring forward if you all wanted to.
If you don't have 6 polling places, that saves you money there.
And I think we should, when you bring us the research, I think we should distinguish between those that are running local elections by mail versus
Right.
statewide elections by mail,
Correct.
because I think it's different. And, you know, if Oregon is running statewide elections for governor and things like that by mail, you know, you're not necessarily going to get, you know, such a significant higher turnout
Right.
if you're doing a municipal election versus something like that.
Right.
So we need to keep that in mind as well.
Is anyone doing online voting these days? Or?
I don't think that technology is
Is that in Russia,
quite
right?
there yet. I mean, I think it'll go to that at some point.
That would be
Um,
Vladimir Putin.
Yeah. But I mean, I think at this point there's probably the technology out there, but I don't think it's been sort of widely implemented enough to have confidence in the security of.
Yeah.
There is the technology, and even the government struggles with that, because when you do a rerun, how do you validate,
Right.
you know, on the rerun? And so my agency was always struggling because there were industries that, like airline pilots, they're mobile they want to vote, you know, not have to go vote a ballot. And so we still always require paper. So that's a problem. I don't know how they're going to fix that one.
I mean, a lot of big public companies, you know, do shareholder votes online
Right.
in secure ways. So, I mean, it's something coming in the future, I think. It's
Sure.
just we're not quite
It
there.
is.
Yeah.
It is. It's just there's a trust hurdle right now, especially given some of the allegations of hacking systems and such.
Mhm.
And I think, you know, a lot of jurisdictions have gone from in-person electronic systems to back to paper
Back to paper,
systems
right.
like we
Yeah.
use. So I think online is probably a ways out still.
I think we'd be one of the less risky jurisdictions for overseas interference with our.
I don't know, Rob.
It'll be local.
All right, next.
Okay, and then we just had, you know, a couple of ideas on voter turnout strategies. One of the things, I know we've talked a lot about absentee voting, but, you know, obviously we implemented early voting in the 2013 election is our first early voting. Of course, that was our uncontested election, so we didn't have a lot of early voting. In the 15 election, we had 3 early voting days. We had a Saturday, a Sunday, and then also a Tuesday evening. The Tuesday evening was pretty dead, kind of quiet. So this past we did we did a Saturday and Sunday. We have seen the number of absentee ballots decline as early voting has become more popular. I think when people have the option of early voting, oftentimes they will take that opportunity versus the absentee. So as we see our early voting numbers coming up, our absentee numbers are coming down. But certainly both options are something that we would want to continue. So I guess the question is whether we would expand our early voting. At least I think from the staff perspective, if we did that, we would probably want to keep it at the Saturday, Sunday, 2 days, but potentially maybe expand the hours. We do 5 hours each day. You know, and then just any ideas we have for additional marketing of the election. We've had some discussion of, I know there's a proposal to be able to put banners on Route 355. Maybe we could include some election banners on 355. And then I think we had talked earlier about promoting or recruiting organizations to hold debates as an idea as well. But certainly we are open to any suggestions that you have on voter turnout. You know, Lauren and I have attended a number of conferences and seminars on election issues, and they say the surefire way to increase voter turnout is to have some big controversy. But that one's not a staff recommendation.
We're to have a partisan election.
Well, we didn't really discuss same-day registration. I mean, I know you presented it, but nobody on the dais kind of has spoken up about that yet. And I just wanted to say I'm supportive of it, especially since it sounds like from staff that it would not be a huge administrative burden. We don't know for sure, but I think, you know, it sounds like that's fairly true. And I would be interested to see what Rockville's experience has been in terms of the administrative burden.
Sure.
If it's fairly minimal. We did have that discussion a couple of years ago. I was actually supportive of same-day registration back then, and I think the compromise was that we went to registration 14 days before,
15, yeah.
15 days
It was
before.
30 and we went to 15. Yeah.
It was 30 and we went to 15 as a compromise, but back then I was interested in the idea of same-day registration as well. And I think, you know, if you do it through provisional ballots, then you avoid the problem of, you know, all this complicated floodgate of of people coming in and voting and not being able to parse out who can vote and who really can't vote. So I think doing it by provisional ballot and having it seem that there's not, a huge influx of people who are going to show up relative to who we have voting now seems to make sense to me. It's another way to, reduce the hurdles to get people to vote and maybe increase our numbers.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, it may be a situation where it may impact when the BOSC can certify the results, but we've talked about we might have to extend that time anyway, because I know the day after the election, I mean, staff does run around all day with the provisional ballots to get information so we can verify those ballots. So if we had more of those, obviously that may take more time, but we may look at, under the current charter, the board has 48 hours to certify. We generally do it within 24, so maybe we would push that back to a Thursday meeting instead of the Wednesday after the election to certify.
I think I was with Ryan on that a couple of years
think you
ago,
were, yeah.
and my opinion hasn't changed, but if we did that and we had to allow extra time, that would give us extra time to accept absentee ballots that were properly mailed. So.
Okay, with that, we were looking for guidance. I think you gave us pretty good guidance on all of these issues. So we will certainly go back to the board, kind of flesh out some of the proposals, and at some point bring those back to you all for introduction or further discussion.
But before you go, let's hear from the public.
Yes.
If anybody here who'd like to speak, we ask that you come up to the podium, state your name and address or neighborhood for the record, and we ask that you keep your remarks to no more than 3 minutes. When your time's down to 2.5, it'll beep and turn yellow. When your time's up, it'll beep and turn red. Come on up, please.
Hi, my name's Carl Van Nest. I live in Gaithersburg off Redding Ridge Drive. Thank you all for having this. What if we had an election and no one showed up? Okay, we're close to that with 9.6% voter turnout. Poor is too nice of a word to use for it. Pathetic, horrible, awful, might be better words. We need to do everything that we can to make voting simple. We need to do everything we can to make it easy for someone to run for office. Also, the people have spoken in Montgomery County. We need to have term limits, 8 to 12 years, something like that. There's plenty of time for someone to be in office. Move on to other things if you're qualified. We canceled an important candidate discussion. That's just bad for voter turnout. We had provisional ballots that were rejected. It sounds like there were about 45 that were there and only 16 were counted. 25 or 29, or whatever that number is like 1% of our vote. So, what was up with that? The wonderful data, Lynn, that you provided, that needs to be put online. I hope that you can do that so that all candidates can, or all potential candidates can look at that information and see it. Why did we build a one-off candidate finance system? Isn't there one in the United States that we could reuse? One-offs are typically expensive, hard to maintain, they're trouble. They don't work very well. A 45-day petition cycle is fine. Keep it tight, allow more people to run. Moving it to 45 days is kind of a regressive activity. Staff time here shouldn't be an issue. It's about, we're doing a pathetic job of getting people out to vote. Candidates and voting are the issue. No slates, they're bad for candidates. It sounds like it's a big quagmire. It also allows incumbents to gang up on new people who are running. Here's an idea. If less than 20% vote, require a revote. We've got better things to worry about than worrying about tree logos. Debates are important. We need to help generate interest. The city should be more proactive, supporting dialogue. There are groups like the League of Women Voters, who everyone loves. They could do this sort of thing for us. An auto recount for a tight race, that's fine. We should follow neighboring or state guidelines. Things should always be faster, not slower. Get people on the council. Recounts must be very fast. Voting by mail is an excellent idea. We need to get better turnout. The stamped envelopes are required. 355 banners,
Carl,
Metro banners,
Carl,
I-270
you're
banners.
at 3 minutes. How much more do you got?
I've got just, I'm almost done. So, again, Route 355, Metro banners, I-270. So, so
Okay.
often when we leave these meetings, we leave with our heads held high. But, with a 9.6, percent voter
Okay.
turnout, we've
Thank
done
you.
a bad job.
Do we have anybody else who'd like to speak? And by the way, Carl, if you had more that you want to submit in writing, please do. Dolly, come on up.
Most of my comments are Dolly Kildee, 212 Summit Hall Road in Gaithersburg. Most of my comments are for clarification. First, on the absentee ballot, mainly what we talked about before was the date that the application is available. And that was the same date as the ballot was available. The application can be available a lot early, so as soon as the ballot's ready, you can send it out. And just a small comment on your slate and your concern about having to file too many treasurer's reports. Usually you're required to have a treasurer, and you would not be doing your own finance report, so you would have a treasurer for your account, you would have a treasurer for the slate account. So that would be less burden on everybody to file your reports. Other than that, I have nothing on the slates. One other thing with voting by mail and absentee voting. Absentee voting, you also have, it's also walk-in voting. So people can, it's early voting too. So a way to promote turnout is to let people know that they can walk in any time when the absentee ballots are available and vote in City Hall, or vote by mail without any excuse for the absentee ballots. That's all I can think of right now.
Okay. If you think of anything more, you can submit to us.
So
in
what
writing
is your
anytime.
next step as far as where we would have input into where you all are going?
Well, next, first, Lynn, Dolly had a suggestion about just going back to your draft timeline, when absentee ballot application. So the idea being, can absentee ballot applications be made available before the actual absentee ballots are? Mm-hmm. So I think that's a fair suggestion. Mm-hmm. You know you're not going to be here, or for whatever reason you want to vote by absentee, you can apply earlier, I suppose.
I mean, I think that we had tried to time that in such a way that the candidate information would be out at the time the applications. I mean, you can still submit the application, and you're not going to get your ballot, obviously, until we know who the certified candidates are. But we thought if you submit your application, too far in advance and we don't know who the candidates are, that can create some issues as well. But there is within that, again, if you go to the 75 days and 60 days, there is some period of time in there from the time that the candidates are certified where the applications could be available.
Is there any link between candidate information and requesting a absentee ballot?
Not necessarily, but I mean, I don't think a lot of people are going to request applications until they know that there are candidates.
That's the key.
Okay, it's something we can consider.
Yeah.
In terms of next steps, Lynn and Lauren got a lot of feedback from us. I think they're going to digest it and then come back with potential ordinance, regulations, guidelines for us to introduce, approve, and any changes to ordinances would require a public hearing process.
Okay, I have one other question about the debates. You want to update the criteria. Is that just for debates that you all host?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, I want to talk to one issue, and this is about provisional ballots. I mean, just because someone wants to vote doesn't give them a right to vote in the city. You have to be a registered voter in the city. You have to be a resident of the city. So it's surprising the number of people that we walk up to early voting, or they walk to the polling place on election day, and they say, I live in Gaithersburg. I have an address in Gaithersburg. My zip code is 20878 or 20877. And when you show them a map, we can show them where the city boundaries are. We don't count the votes of ineligible voters. That's partly what those provisional ballot cancellations were. Then there are people who are just not registered. So if we go to same-day registration, that would solve that problem. So, you know, I was surprised to hear the charge that we're just throwing ballots, you know, in the trash, because we're not. And we're just verifying that people are eligible to vote. And every voter has the right and expectation that the people who vote in our elections are legal voters in the city. So, you know, and sometimes we just get more people that want to vote. They're interested even though they don't live in the city. They participate.
And piggyback to what Mike just said, I was going to point out, I wouldn't be surprised if the number of provisional ballots from people who don't live in the city but aren't sure or think they might goes up as we increase our marketing efforts. Because if we're out there on social media blasting, as we were these last, you know, 1 or 2 cycles, trying to get a higher turnout from people and let them know there's an election, it would stand to reason that there may be some people who aren't necessarily in the city but who are going to see some of those advertisements and go, oh, I'll go and vote. And that's where you end up getting a higher number of provisional ballots as well. But it's a reflection of the fact that we're doing a better job marketing, ironically, maybe. I certainly think it's, you know, it's not for lack of trying. We have significantly increased our marketing budget over the last couple of cycles. We've engaged social media much more than we ever have in the last couple of cycles. You know, there was kind of a joke made earlier about, you know, if you want to increase turnout, you know, have a scandal or have a controversy. And, you know, one of the tricky things about being in a democracy like ours is that we can't force people to vote. Right. You know, I hate to say this. I know, you know, politicians never want to say this, but, you know, it may be that, you know, the fact that turnout isn't as high as we want it to be is that, you know, people think things are pretty good, and so you can't drive people to be interested in voting if they don't have a controversy to get riled up about. I think everybody should vote who can vote, but we can't force them to. You know, so I want to say that because I don't want this proceeding to close on the suggestion that we haven't been trying a lot harder in the last 1 or 2 cycles than we did in the past. And we'll continue to come up with creative ideas that we can come up with to try and get more people to vote. And that's why we're exploring things like, you know, extending vote by mail or more days for early voting and things like that. So,
Neil?
Yeah, but still been pathetic.
Carl, thank you. You've had your chance to speak. We're going to hear from the dais. Neil?
Look, everyone up here agrees with that the voter turnout needs to be much higher in the city, okay? I mean, we are all doing our best, personally as well as collectively, and we're spending $10 a vote, basically, right, with $30,000 budget to get the vote out. Can we be more effective? You know, we'll see. I mean, I know I spend money on Facebook to try to get people to show up, and it seems to be somewhat effective. Just to reiterate on Mike's point, because I've seen people come to City Hall who want to vote and don't actually live in the city. The city has just shy of 70,000 actual residents, but people whose envelopes, when they get mail, say Gaithersburg, there are 135,000. And they don't necessarily realize that they're not in incorporated Gaithersburg. They're in greater Gaithersburg or something like that. We haven't annexed them yet. So anyway, that's a lot of reason that I've seen for people to show up at City Hall and say, I want to vote for Judd. And they're like, well, sorry, you can't vote for him because you don't actually live here.
But we shouldn't
But
be
we don't say you
turning
can't.
anyone
Right.
away.
That's where
Yeah, and that-
But if they don't live in
Provisional
Gaithersburg,
ballot.
then we have to turn them
You
away.
cannot turn them away.
You can
If
pay
they say
taxes
they
to
live
us,
in
they vote for
Gaithersburg, you cannot verify.
Yeah,
If
and
their
then-
address isn't actually in Gaithersburg.
But, you know, we don't
cannot
argue with them. We
prevent
take a
anyone-
provisional ballot.
Exactly.
Right.
You
Well,
take it. You
no, I
can't
agree.
prevent anyone from
No, but you can't count their vote.
Right.
if they're-
No,
if they don't
but
live in
they'll
Gaithersburg.
still be able to vote.
That's exactly what I was saying, is that
Yeah,
they
and
show
that-
up thinking that they live in Gaithersburg because their mail comes to Gaithersburg.
And I mean, that's one thing that we do specifically instruct all of our election judges is, you know, we don't want to be confrontational with people. If somebody comes in and they want to vote, we'll let them vote.
let them
And they vote provisional, even though we know that they're not a city resident, we still let them vote. But
Do you give them a
again, I
sticker
think
too?
that's
Yes.
yeah, we do.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I mean, I think that's kind of why we have such a high percentage of provisionals that aren't counted.
Right. Rob?
So I'm intrigued by the notion of a walk-in vote. I mean, could we just think about, not here right now tonight, but the logistical and security issues associated with having continuous voting at City Hall from the date the candidates are certified to the date of Election Day. So you come in and you're paying your a fee for an electrical permit or something, vote.
Yeah. I
And
mean,
so-
we kind of informally do that, but we don't really advertise that we do that. But I guess your question is, should we advertise that you can just come in and vote anytime?
Well, it always
I mean,
struck
it
me as
does-
odd that official voting day is a Tuesday when most people work.
Yeah.
As a,
Well, that's why we have early voting.
we have early voting, but we only have early voting in one location as opposed to the 6 that we offer elsewhere. And we saw that early voting is heavily biased toward the part of the city that's close to the voting location, which is not rocket science. So maybe, you know, I mean, rocking the boat too much probably, but, you know, having voting on a weekend at all the usual voting places might really do a lot more for turnout because that's when people are available. You don't have to get a babysitter, you don't have to go to work, get up early or try to rush home from work. But I don't know if that's really feasible and if you want to have elections on 2 days.
Could we do an early voting booth at Oktoberfest? I mean, we get
You know, we,
25
you know, we,
free beer.
you joked about that, but we did talk about, at
I'm not
Oktoberfest
joking.
this last year of having absentee ballots available where people could actually apply and then vote. I mean, I think our biggest concern was because we were in an open air booth
Yep.
was security issues.
The
Now, I
integrity
mean,
of the ballot.
maybe if we had a room like in the mansion or in, you know, the arts barn, you know, might be a different issue, but, you know, I think we were concerned in kind of in that open setting of being able to secure all of the ballots and the information. Yeah.
I would say that-
But we did talk about
yeah.
that last time.
The point is be creative.
Yeah.
That's-
I think we can talk at any time of the year about things that we can do to increase voter turnout. I don't think we have to wait for this particular issue.
Sure.
It's about as marketing and communication as much as anything else. So,
Right.
you know, if those ideas come up over the course of the year, it's strategic planning, when we're talking about the budget, I think I'm prepared to support those ideas. Yeah, it is a poor turnout, but we do know that those people who vote are interested in what's going on in the city, and that's why they vote.
You need more controversy, that's what it's about.
Maybe we need a ballot question.
I know what Ryan did last
Well,
summer.
if we know that people tend to vote when there's a contested mayoral election, maybe a 2-year term for mayor would be.
I wanted to, just before I forget, also.
No chance of a slate now, right, Judd?
I wanted to raise a suggestion for the early voting. I did have a couple of voters who communicated with me during the last election that they were a little bit frustrated because they would go on the Saturday during the period of time that the early voting was open on Sunday, or go on Sunday
Yeah.
during the period of time that
They're
it was open on
different time
Saturday.
frames, yeah. Mhm.
And I think it might just be a little less confusing for the public, even though it'd be more staff time. Instead of having, and I realize what you guys were trying to do is sort of stagger the times of
Right.
day so that someone could come in the morning on a Saturday or the afternoon on a Sunday, but it might be less confusing to have it the same times of day, so it, you know, it opens earlier in the morning both days and stays open till late afternoon both days. So I just throw that out there. I don't think it was a major problem, but I did talk to a couple of people about that. So
I
And,
think
I
you
mean-
have to account for church and people going to religious meetings on Saturday and Sunday. So I think
Yeah.
that's why it's staggered. But if we just stagger both at 12, I think that would be.
Well, some
I
people
like
watch
the
football in the afternoon, so
Yeah.
we can't win.
This is all, I
That's a
think
religion around
staff
here.
at this point feels guided. I don't know if we're
And
gonna
then I
solve that
have
tonight.
one more question. Since Mike clarified the provisional ballots, it may be helpful to differentiate between what was the problem with the original ballots cast and then the other ones, why they weren't accepted, like the other.
Yeah, I mean, we do have a chart that actually we do provide to the board that when they certified the provisional, that, I mean, we go through each and every
Yeah.
one individually, and, you know, this one's not being accepted because they're not a city resident, this one's because they're not registered to vote. So, you know, so we do have all that information as to why each ballot is not accepted.
Because I think it's easy to make that assumption that are we just throwing
Right.
things
Well,
without
I
clarifying?
would never accuse the BOSE of doing anything like that. I think they're very careful. I think it's important to explain to the public what the
Definitely.
process is that every one of those ballots, in order to be counted as an eligible vote, has to be verified that they're a city resident, that they're registered to vote, and that they voted. So,
Okay. I don't think it's an easy assumption to say we're just going to throw away certain ballots.
Well, no, not, I mean, you can make any assumption. So for someone
Not
to
easily.
someone drew an assumption because it wasn't clear. So we just have to be clear, and
Okay.
we won't make any assumptions.
Know what happens when you assume.
And with that, we thank you all for being with us. We thank you all for being with us. Look forward to what comes out of it. Next week, we have a regular meeting on Tuesday because of the President's Day holiday. So until next time, let's do great things, Gaithersburg. We are adjourned.